Pirenne-Delforge. So Vinciane Pirenne-Delforge is speaking to us today. And she's in the Collège de France. She occupies the professorial chair of religion, history, and society in ancient Greece. And she's one of the best known researchers in the area of the history of Greek religion. She wrote her first book was a marvelous methodologically innovative study of Aphrodite, L'Aphrodite grecque, in 1994. She's written extensively on Pausanias. Pausanias et la religion grecque in 2008. And most recently, she's published a book on Hera, which is also available in English as The Hera of Zeus, and a book on Herodotus and Greek religion, Le polytheism grec à l'épreuve d'Hérodote, which appeared just in 2020. And she's equally well versed in the textual and the material record. So I want very warmly to welcome her today and to ask her to please give us her talk on Herodotus as a historian of religions and polytheism, the Egyptian matrix. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Is it all right? Do you see the screen?
Yes, it's good. Yeah. It's fine.
Okay. So thank you, Peter, for your kind words. And I must give you some precision at the very beginning. When Arpad Naj first asked me to give a talk in the present context, we were in Freiburg in Switzerland, attending together a conference, and I show you if I succeeded in showing you. Yes, we were attending at a conference with our common friend François Lissarac, to whom Graeco-Aegyptiaca was dedicated some time ago, and it was very moving for me. And it was in September 2021, and both Arpad and François tried to convince me to do so and to come in your lecture series, even if my first thought was to decline, not because of friendship, but because I had no current research that seemed suitable for a lecture series entitled Graeco-Aegyptiaca. They insisted, and it's hard to resist Arpad, and it was hard to resist my dear friend François. And in short, I finally proposed to present a very famous case study that combines Greece and Egypt with Herodotus' Book 2 and his investigation on the origin of Greek religion. I must admit that this is a rather broad understanding of the theme of this program, and I hope that those who are disappointed by this broadening of the topic will excuse me. So after this captatio benevolentia, I start my speech, which has 3 parts. The first part is a clarification of Herodotus' method of investigation into religion. The second part deals with the question of the origin of the Greek gods according to the investigator, and at this point, the Egyptian matrix of my title comes into play. The third and final part is rooted in current questions about the ways Greek polytheism works, echoing Herodotus' investigation. And Peter mentioned 2 minutes ago my book about Le polythéisme grec à l'épreuve d'Hérodote, and of course, the talk of today is partially based on this book. This book in French. So first, so the first part about the histories, prose and human point of view. As soon as antiquity, Herodotus has been seen as the most Homeric of the historians. And in the Pride of Halicarnassus, a famous Hellenistic inscription glorifying the city, Herodotus of Halicarnassus is called and you see the Greek on the screen, the Homer in prose of historiography. As it has been recognized for a long time, Herodotus is deeply indebted to his poetic predecessors, both for the presentation of his inquiry and for the topics he addresses. Even if Aristotle made a strong distinction between poetry and history, Herodotus' work is like a gathering of the Iliad and the Odyssey in the same time, a big war on the one hand, and on the other hand, a description of the world and of communities with so many different habits and customs. However, contrary to archaic poets, Herodotus does not invoke inspiration as his source of authority, and the gods are completely absent from the preface of the histories. He does not rely on divinity, and his authority is based on human means. This is the first deep difference with poetry. But a second one, closely related to the first, is probably even more important when religion is concerned. In archaic poetry, and especially in Homeric epics, particular gods, so specific gods, named as such, are active protagonists in close interaction with human beings. Active gods, in this sense, are almost completely absent from Herodotus' inquiry. The choice to limit divine intervention in human history to expressions like the divine, to theon, the divinity, ho theos, or the god, the theos, in the singular, or the gods, theoi, in the plural, resonates with passages of the second book, which has been extensively discussed for more than a century. And I paraphrase these well-known passages you see on the screen. It's book 2, chapter 3, and book 2, chapter 65. So I don't read the translation as such, but the paraphrase is regarding divine matters, tateia pragmata. I'm not ready to expose them. When I rarely do it, this is only of narrative necessity. And Herodotus switches, therefore, to human matters, anthropeia pragmata. The extensive register of specific divine actions, which is at the forefront of epic poetry, is almost completely ignored by Herodotus. He refers only in general terms to the providential dimension of human history. Particular gods can be present in some stories reported in the histories, and it's the places of the histories where when Herodotus writes, some say that. But in his own narrative voice, Herodotus mentioned divine action only twice in the nine books. Accordingly, Herodotus has not abandoned attempts to explain some aspect of history by some divine providence or intervention. However, in this case, the vocabulary remains generic, and the gods have almost completely vanished from the territory of the historian as specific powers acting in the world, specific and named powers acting in the world. The archaic poet, let's say Homer, was inspired by the muse, or supposed to be inspired by the muse, and the poet adopted the global point of view of an omniscient narrator and described human as well as divine action in the various places humans and gods were occupying, alone or together. Herodotus also tells the wonderful story of an exceptional war in order to keep the memory of glorious deeds. You all know the introduction of the histories, but he does not adopt a divine point of view to express divine action. He only sticks to the human point of view. In the passages on the screen, stating the decision of Herodotus to avoid referring to divine matters, a part of the program exposed by the author begins to open the door to the Egyptian matrix of my title. And for example, the second text on the screen, book 2, 65, it's the place when Herodotus is referring to sacred animals in Egypt, and he doesn't want to address this, the sacrality of the animals, because in this case, he should be brought to speak of divine mothers, and he doesn't want to do this. 50 chapters later, after the 2-3, Herodotus comes back to the names of the gods and gives to this audience, for the first time in our Greek evidence, a history of human knowledge of the divine, which is the second part of my talk. And sorry for this first part, which can seem to be quite well known by many of you, but I wanted to be sure that we started from the same point, the same level of knowledge in Herodotus' work. So, the second point, where do Greek gods come from? The first step in answering this question is the reconstruction of the origin of the gods, or to be more precise, the origin, as we will see immediately, of the onomata of the gods, their names. Since the Egyptians are very ancient people, all the similarities between their habits and the Greek ones automatically imply for Herodotus that these Greek habits are inherited from Egypt. The model is as simple as efficient in terms of causality. It's the same, it looks the same, so it must be an heritage from Egypt. But regarding the gods, details of the process evidenced by Herodotus are less easy to understand. And I quote some elements of the chapter 50, still in the second book, of course. And I read the translation with you, and my translation I taken from the library with some slight modification when I want to be more related to the letter of the Greek text. So I read the text on the screen. All the onomata, and I don't translate onomata for the moment, all the onomata of the gods came to Greece from Egypt, except the onomata of Poseidon and the Dioscuri. And Hera and Hestia and Themis and the Graces, so the Charitus and the Nereids, the onomata of all the gods have ever existed in Egypt. The gods whose onomata they say they do not know were, as I think, named by the Pelagians, save only Poseidon. Of this god, they learn knowledge from the Libyans. So, touton de tonteon, paralibuon, et putonton. Alone of all nations, the Libyans have had among them the unoma of Poseidon from the first, and they have ever honored this god. So, kai timosi tonteon touton aie. In the never-ending debate, because I'm perfectly conscious that this is a hard debate, in the never-ending debate about the significance of unoma in this passage between name in the primary sense of the word, or designation in the sense of the fact to give a name, I decidedly stand on the side of the designation for two reasons at least. First, Herodotus has extensively, as you know, applied the well-known process of translating in Greek the names of foreign gods in the first 4 books of the histories, all along the inquiry of the nomoi, the customs of many different peoples. As far as linguistic coherence is to be found in the histories, and it's the argument of those who want to keep its literal sense of name to unoma, it seems to be more coherent to interpret the unomata of gods as the fact to give a name to gods than to strictly understand them as names, whereas we are perfectly conscious, just as Herodotus was, that the same gods were identified by different words, names. How to reconcile Herodotus' statement that, for example, the Egyptians called Zeus Amun, with the other statement that the name of Zeus as Zeus comes from Egypt? By considering that the Greeks have inherited from the idea to identify the god honored by the Egyptians as Amun by giving him a name that is Zeus. Second argument in favor of the denomination instead of the name as such. Second argument, 3 passages of the histories still in the second book give us some clue to understand the unomata of the gods. The first is still on your screen. It's 255. The first is an argument, among other elements, an argument. In this text, you have an argument about Poseidon and his Libyan origin. When Herodotus comments on the transfer of the name from Libya, he writes, of this god they learned knowledge from the Libyans. I don't know if you see the arrow of my computer, but it's here, it's a tuton, deton, theon, etc. The name becomes, in this sentence, the name becomes the god itself. What is transferred from culture to culture is a divine profile to whom each culture gives its proper name in its own language. I announced 3 passages, so it was the first. The second passage is located in the chapter 49, just before the development about the unomata borrowed from Egypt. And in this case, Herodotus is referring to Dionysus, the Greek equivalent of Osiris. I quote, and you have the translation on the screen. It's Melampus who explained to the Greeks the unoma of Dionysus and the way of sacrificing to him and the phallic procession. And you have the participle exegesamenos. The exegesis attributed to the heroic prophet refers to the transfer of Osiris into Greece. Its profile and cult all together, but adapted to the Greek context with slight changes. So we can see here that it's broader than only the name. The third and last passage that I want to display is a kind of conclusion that appears in the chapter 51, just after the development about the unomata. And you have these, I quote the translation on the screen, these customs. So he has just explained his view of the unomata. It's the unomata. These customs, then and others besides, which I shall indicate, were taken by the Greeks from the Egyptian. So if I take the sentence more literally, I can translate it. Besides these things which I have mentioned, there are many other practices, so many other nomos. It's behind the verb ninomikasi in the sentence, which the Greeks learn from Egypt. So the unomata of the gods belong to the category of the nomoi borrowed from Egypt. All these cumulated arguments converge to support the understanding of onomata as the habit of using names, so denomination, for identifying specific deities. And so that's the point of the Egyptian matrix. In the development by Herodotus, the Egyptians are the key interlocutor for this habit of giving name to gods. And the following chapter of Herodotus, after 51, is the next step in his history of religion and helps me to consolidate this view, as I hope. So, as you know, the designation of gods is not the first step of the history of religion designed by Herodotus. And I read with you the passage on the screen, Book 2, chapter 52, very famous passage. Formerly, the Pelagian offered sacrifices calling upon gods, so theoi. This I know from, I was told at Dodona, without giving surname or name to any. So it's eponymien ud unoma. For they had no as yet heard of such, the fact to give a name to a god, to a theos. They called them gods because all things and the due assignment thereof were by them set in order. So it's a play, a gameplay, no, a play on the words, a word play, sorry. Then after a long while, they learned the onomata first of the rest of the gods, which came to them from Egypt, and much later that of Dionysus. We saw it with Melampus. When the Pelagian then inquired at Dodona if they should adopt the onomata they had come from the barbarians, the oracle ordered to use them. From that time onwards, they offer sacrifice using the onomata of the gods. And the Greeks received these later from the Pelagian. In this passage, as in the others, Herodotus fully complies with his program. His point of view is only human, and when he's referring to the gods, he limits his analysis to the onomata. That's exactly what he said before. The way of identifying a god by giving him a name depends on local usage. These various nomoi recognized and displayed in his ethnographic inquiries. The Pelagian point of view about the gods is the starting element of his history of religions. They pay homage to gods in sacrifices without specifically identifying them. However, they do not pray, and it's very important to me, they do not pray a vague and generic divine in the singular. The Pelagian divine world is immediately plural. It remains undefined, but its components are potentially recognizable. What is missing to the Pelagian people at this stage is the capacity to progress from a limited and raw apprehension of the gods who order the world to the precise knowledge of the various divine powers working into the world. The Egyptian wisdom, rooted in a deep past, is supposed to have addressed the Pelagian deficiencies and shortcomings in understanding some of the gods. And Melampus did exactly the same later with Dionysus by a process of explanation and elucidation that the Greeks call exegesis. You remember the participle that I mentioned. The last step of Herodotus' history of religion is the role played by Homer and Hesiod 400 years before him. And once again, the passage is well known. So whence each of the gods came, whether they had always existed, and what were their forms, idea, or figures, the Greek knew nothing of till of till the other day, so to speak. For Homer and Hesiod, I think, lived only 400 years before my time and not more. It was they who made the theogony for the Greek and gave surnames, so eponymiae, to the gods, and distributed honors, timai, and competences, technai, and signified their forms, idea auton semenantes. As Rosalind Thomas has shown in her famous book, Herodotus in Context, published in Cambridge in 2000, the conjunction of forms and naming, so you have eponymia, onoma first, then eponymia and idea, and I quote Rosalind Thomas in his book, reappears also in the Hippocratic on the art, at a point when it was not absolutely necessary for his argument. The author brings up the issue of the relation of names, onoma, eponymiae, and forms, idea. The names being institution and the forms belonging to physis. And so the question is, the fact that in Herodotus, the idea of the gods are not simply given like eponymiae or distributed like timai and technai, you see the different verbs on the screen, but are signified or disclosed, you have the verb seminein, could echo this kind, does it echo this kind of contemporary discussion among the sophists about nomos versus physis, as well as the capacity of human mind to acquire an firm knowledge about the God? So it's asked quite often as far as Herodotus is concerned, because of course the sophistic movement behind can perhaps be considered when he refers to nomoi and idea, or unomata and idea. But I would like to ask another question to address this point, but I wanted to have a look to this debate against the background of the sophistic movement. Do the use of seminein at the end of the passage you have on the screen in this context imply that Herodotus attributed to the poet some true knowledge about the physis of the gods? Is it the meaning of this passage? In other words, since the oracular inspiration is par excellence the place of the seminein, should we conclude from this passage that some sort of divine truth lies behind the divine aspect disclosed by Homer and Hesiod, according to Herodotus? In order to understand Greek polytheism as it was conceived and understood by an insider, the question is not a matter of detail. That's why Herodotus, book 2, is so interesting when we try to understand how the Greeks themselves try to understand their own system, To deepen this point, another passage of the histories is interesting in its reference to the way the Greeks represented their gods. In the first book, Herodotus extensively describes the Persian nomoi. It's book 1, as you see on the screen, chapter 131 and 32. In this context, we are told that the Persians, and you can see the Greek and the translation on the screen, we are told that the Persians, contrary to the Greeks, do not consider that the gods are anthropophyai. The word anthropophyes is rare, and it underscores, in the strictest sense of the word, a human physis attributed to their gods by the Greeks. Not simply a human form, but also a human mind, temper, expectation, etc. Moreover, if we take into account, if we take into account the fact that Herodotus is referring to nomoi at this point of his talk, as you see at the very beginning of the passage on the screen, it implies that this kind of conception belongs to the realm of the conventional custom and habits distributed among the various human groups to which Herodotus refers. So even this physis attributed to the gods doesn't imply that in the former passage, the poets are considered to reveal, to disclose this physis. If we come back to 253 after reading 131, how can we understand the fact that poets were supposed so to have disclosed the idea of the gods? The verb seminein means giving some sense to something that remained unknown or badly understood. The famous fragment of Heraclitus, I didn't put it in my PowerPoint presentation. So, but I quote the translation: the Lord, so Apollo, whose oracle is in Delphi, does not speak, does not conceal, he discloses, and you have semi-name behind the translation. This sentence attests that the signs, the semeia, given in a divine context, do not provide any logical demonstration, but offers some clues to perceive a sense which is not necessarily the last word of what is signified. Accordingly, if I understand correctly both passage, so 131 and 253, the anthropophues conception of the Greek gods, which lies behind the idea signified by the poets, is only one human way of figuring gods and does not necessarily point to their physis, which remains unreachable to the human mind. If Herodotus is probably conscious of sophistic discussion about forms and names, he does not implement them uncritically in his own inquiry about the gods. And so now, the third part and last part of my talk, which refers to Graeca and no more to Aegyptiaca, and I'm sorry for that. Oops. So it's our question about polytheism. So we saw 2 minutes ago the word anthropophues. The problem of what we call the Greek anthropomorphism lies behind this word anthropophues, but also behind the 3 words of 253, idea auton semenantes. Let us take into consideration the divine idea designed by Homer. There are 3 levels in the manner of figuring gods in the epic poetry. So it's exactly the fact to signify the gods. First, gods among gods. They are depicted like human beings, feasting and deliberating on Mount Olympus in a society working like any human society. Second, in Homer, still in Homer, gods among humans. They are able to adopt different shapes. A human duly identified like Mentor for Athena in Ithaca, or the nurse of Helen for Aphrodite on the Trojan defensive wall, or a strong move felt by a soldier on the battlefield, or birds on a tree overhanging a single combat. Third, the statue of Athena over a temple in Book 6 of the Iliad, when the queen Hecuba and the old women of Troy are praying the goddess to save their city. In the theogony of the other poet, Hesiod, the primordial gods are physical elements involved in action described in human terms. Aphrodite becomes a Kure after emerging from the semen of Uranus mixed with the foam of the sea, and Pandora, the first of all women, is like an immortal goddess for the face and is given the charming appearance of a lovely girl. Just like in the Odyssey, Hermione, the daughter of Menelaus, and Helen has the appearance of golden Aphrodite, or Odysseus considers that Nausicaa must be Artemis due to her stature, megathos, her fine growth, Phue, and her heidos. So we have the mirror effect between goddess in all these examples. The mirror effect between goddesses and beautiful women is impressive in all these examples, because beauty is an irresistible reference to divine nature, as we know from Plato also. But slight deviation and discrepancies attest that the mirror effect is limited and even tricky, because the perspective is always human. Potentially, the immanent nature of the Greek gods and their dynamis, their power, exceeds all human capacities, and it opens the door to any manifestation of their power under as many appearances as the multifarious forms of living beings in the world. So anthropomorphism is, of course, very important on the background, against the backgrounds of ancient Greece, but you have so many discrepancies and limitations to this form that, of course, Herodotus was perfectly conscious that the archaic poet had disclosed some of the possibilities of representing gods at the time of attributing eponymiae, themai, technai to the gods, but he did not mean that they reached the physis of the divine. And so it was the first of our question mentioned the first question mentioned in the title of my third part. The second is related to some recent works about the notion of divine power in the ancient world. The question is, and you will recognize the question, Greek gods, are they persons or powers? And it's rooted in two famous papers written by Jean-Pierre Vernant in the 60s, Aspect de la personne en Grèce antique et la Société des dieux, where he stated, and I quote this in French, les dieux grecs sont des puissances et non des personnes. It's a very difficult point when you are moving from French to English, because puissance is difficult to translate in English, because English doesn't have a word with the same kind of nuance. Strongly emphasizing that Greek gods are not independent personalities, but related powers within a pantheon was a necessity in the 16th, when Vernant wrote this line. At this time, ancient Greek religion was still seen as a range of juxtaposed monotheisms, each deity in his own box or her own box, honored by his own worshippers and represented in various narratives. On the other hand, at the same time, the Christian determinism of a personal relation to a personal God lied behind some works about Greek religion, as the personal religion among the Greeks delivered by André Jean Festugière as Sade lecture and published in 1954. In this context, Vernant had to tackle both Christian determinism and an old-fashioned conception of the Greek gods inherited from the Renaissance. He did not ignore that gods had to be approached by the Greeks as being with whom interaction in the human terms of reciprocity and exchange was possible. And this is precisely the anthropophues, as Herodotus mentioned it. But Vernant stressed the fact that gods are, powers who are in close connection with other powers, so it's anthropophues here, even if they are mainly represented as if they were singular personalities. And I admit that I was persuaded that this lesson of Vernant had been integrated into scholarship for long, but the question of the gods as persons or as powers and or as powers is coming back to the forefront now, more than 50 years later, in a current trend of research searching for personal or lived ancient religion. And I don't have enough time to put this trend in the context of the battle against the polytheist religion perspective inaugurated some years ago. I did it elsewhere, and I will continue to do it, but it's to give you the background of this problem addressed by Vernon 50 years ago, and which, or even 60 years ago, and still present in scholarship. My point here, and I come back, of course, to my title, is Herodotus and his history of ancient polytheism. He is an insider. Of the culture that he describes, and such an emic perspective must be taken seriously into account for understanding the Greek gods as a fluid system of representation without dogma. That's why Herodotus is so interesting for anyone studying ancient Greek religion. My point here, as you, I hope, understand perfectly well, is not the religion of Herodotus, but the way Herodotus addressed the question of religion and how he explains the history of the system to which he belongs. So I recall the 3 steps in his history of Greek polytheism. First, the Pelagian know and honor some theoi still unnamed. Second step, they give denomination to some of these gods whose specific powers were therefore identified in contrast to each other's. Third, the Greek archaic poets enter the scene. They attribute competencies and honors to the gods. They design, they signify their figures. In the first 2 steps, gods are powers among other powers. This is the background of the last moment, when poets translate these powers in acting figures whose forms can be closely related to human figures, and this way of doing belongs to the Greek nomoi in matters of religious conception. But the last step, so the moment when poets are singing the gods, the last step does not obliterate the 2 first moments, the recognition of specific divine powers. In French, I would say puissance divine, but in English, I'm obliged to use the word power, which I would translate in French as pouvoir, and it's not exactly the same, but anyway, it's another debate. The coexistence of these 2 levels, divine powers first, and then divine figures with a human agency, must never be forgotten when we try to understand the polytheism of the Greeks. The third and last question, and I come to my conclusion, the third and last questions, with which I will conclude my talk, opens a door that I won't close today, but I still have to work a lot on this aspect of our studies. When he published his book on Greek religion in 1999, the late Simon Price chose to give it the title Religions of the Greeks, with both religion and Greek in the plural, as you see on the screen. He justified this choice by the necessity to suggest the interplay between local and Panhellenic practices and ideas and the resulting variety in both space and time. I do not feel completely comfortable with this choice because it implies a fragmentation of religious practices and ideas that does not justice to some common background of practices and ideas, a common knowledge shared by the various Greek communities and poleis. And I will try to address this point with Herodotus in mind. If I take once more his work as a witness for understanding the ancient Greek religion, he conceived something which was Greek as such, as far as the relationship with the gods was concerned. The existence of a Panhellenic background, and I use Panhellenic because it's easily understandable. This existence of a Panhellenic background is explicitly stated in the passage about Homer and Hesiod. However, it does not imply that religious manifestation in the entire Greek world are uniform enough to make such a comparison useful to fill in gaps. But as Fritz Graf, and I give you the reference on the screen, as Fritz Graf rightly remarked some years ago, there was, and I quote him in this paper, there was a basic linguistic unity of Greekness despite the many local dialects. And the dialectic of a common Hellenic language and its multiple dialectal expression might be a useful model on which to understand the tension between Panhellenic and local religion in the singular. At the level of his own inquiry, and I put once again on the screen the passage 131 about the nomoi of the Persians. At the level of his own inquiry, Herodotus placed the Greek nomoi as such in comparison to other nomoi adopted in other regions of the Mediterranean basin. He did not emphasize the variation within the Greek world, even though he was perfectly conscious